This reflection is for Palm Passion Sunday. In this extended period of fasting from the Sunday Eucharist, let us awaken our sense memories and enliven our imaginations to welcome the presence of Christ that surrounds us, wherever we are, even now, especially now. With more than 50 weeks on the calendar, few Mass attendees passing through the church doors know precisely which Sunday of the liturgical year the faithful are gathering to celebrate. Not so on Palm Passion Sunday. The familiar sight of palm sprays on the altar, the smell of fresh fronds pressed into our hands, the feel of the curly strings tickling our fingers, all evoke the beginning of the great story, focusing our collective imagination on the noisy, crowded streets of Jerusalem. The splashy entrance rite overflows with brilliant hosannas and bright color. But once we settle into our seats, the liturgy of the Word leaves behind the joyful clamor of the Palm celebration and turns our attention toward the distant hill with the stark crosses. Today, the Scriptures point to the figure of Jesus in his fully realized humanity, in his generosity and vulnerability, as he surrenders all to the will of his Abba, his Father. Entering Jerusalem, he starts the chain of events that will bring about reconciliation between humanity and God through his paschal mystery, and will also reshape the Jewish Passover into the paschal feast of the new covenant in his body and blood, our Eucharist. Jesus embodies the central figure of today's first reading, Isaiah's suffering servant. In the preaching and teaching that we have heard about in the gospel reading Sunday after Sunday, Jesus uses his well-trained tongue to speak to the weary, and his words indeed rouse them to faith and devotion to God's reign. Those with much to lose are also roused to unbelief and violent resistance to this threatening first shall be last rearrangement of the status quo. The unwavering obedience of Jesus to the Father's will, despite threats against his life, arises from an intimate relationship of trust built on prayer. Morning after morning he opens my ear that I may hear, beautifully portrays the continuity of the conversation between Jesus and his Abba, as nighttime prayers give way to dreams, and the message of dreams lingers in the conscious mind upon waking. I have not rebelled, have not turned back, shows the depth of his trust in the Father's steady instruction. Psalm 22 seems at first to signal a break in the relationship with its refrain, my God, why have you abandoned me?" But if we persevere in our listening to the end of the psalm, we move with the psalmist from plea to praise, or at least the vow to praise. I will proclaim your name. This vow demonstrates trust. The psalmist expects to be delivered. Even amid terrible suffering, the conversation of covenant partners continues. St. Paul's letter to the Philippians expands on the theme of obedience. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Christ's humility, his emptying of self, opens the way to his obedience. And his obedience opens the way to our salvation. If we consider Philippians 2, 6 through 11 in its biblical context, we notice that the Apostle Paul suspends his usual dense prose in favor of a hymn, a pre-existent piece of liturgy, most probably well known at the time of his writing. He cites this familiar text, this beloved song of faith, to remind the Philippians of their commitment to live justly as true disciples of Jesus, the servant Lord. Verses 6 through 8 present Jesus in his humility and obedience as the model for their behavior and ours. Following the example of Jesus, they and we can move beyond self-interest toward compassion and true community. This splendid hymn also encapsulates and enshrines the Paschal mystery, the suffering and death and resurrection of Jesus that accomplishes our salvation. We celebrate this mystery at every Eucharist, but once a year, after the long journey of Lent, our Church invites us to deepen our experience of the Paschal mystery, calling for a continuum of ritual prayer over the 3 days of the Sacred Triduum.